The Mafia boss was known for one thing. He never repeated an order twice. That night at the restaurant, he ordered his steak rare, just like always. But when the waitress leaned in to set down his plate, her hand trembled. Without a word, she slipped a folded note beneath the silver fork. He opened it. Just one glance and the color drained from his face. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next will leave you stunned. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. Vincent Torino commanded respect through silence. In a world where men shouted to be heard, his whispers carried the weight of thunder. At 58 years old, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 states. Yet tonight, he sat alone in his favorite corner booth at Bella Notte, the upscale Italian restaurant he'd been frequenting for over 2 decades. The burgundy leather beneath him had molded to his frame from countless evenings just like this one. The restaurant buzzed with its usual Friday night energy. Crystal glasses clinked against fine china while conversations flowed like expensive wine. But Vincent existed in his own bubble of calculated observation. His steel-gray eyes swept across the dining room, cataloging faces, noting newcomers, filing away details that others would dismiss as meaningless. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival. His usual waitress, Maria, had called in sick that evening. In her place stood a young woman Vincent had never seen before. She couldn't have been older than 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and nervous energy that radiated from her like heat from a flame. Her name tag read Sarah, and she approached his table with the kind of careful respect that suggested someone had briefed her on exactly who she was serving. Vincent ordered without looking at the menu. Ribeye steak, rare, with roasted potatoes and asparagus. A glass of Chianti Classico, the 2018 vintage. No modifications, no substitutions, no unnecessary conversation. Sarah scribbled notes on her pad with hands that shook just enough for Vincent to notice. Most people would have attributed her nervousness to serving an intimidating customer. Vincent had learned long ago that most people were wrong about most things. While he waited, Vincent's mind drifted to the morning's events. His nephew Tony had brought disturbing news from the docks. Shipments were arriving late. Money was going missing. And worst of all, federal agents had been asking questions about his legitimate businesses. The kind of questions that suggested someone on the inside was talking. Vincent had survived 4 decades in this life by trusting his instincts, and those instincts were screaming that danger was closing in from multiple directions. The restaurant's ambiance provided the perfect cover for his thoughts. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, while the warm glow of chandeliers cast dancing shadows across white tablecloths. This place had always been his sanctuary, a neutral ground where business stayed outside, and he could simply exist as a man enjoying a good meal. Tonight felt different. Tonight, the familiar comfort felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. Sarah returned with his wine, setting it down with practiced precision despite her obvious nerves. Vincent tasted it, nodded his approval, and watched her retreat toward the kitchen. Something about her movements nagged at him. She walked like someone carrying a heavy burden, her shoulders slightly hunched, her steps measured and deliberate. He'd seen that posture before, in his own mirror during the darkest periods of his career. 20 minutes later, his steak arrived. Sarah approached the table with the same nervous energy, but now Vincent detected something else beneath the surface: determination. Her jaw was set in a way that spoke of a decision made and a line crossed. As she leaned forward to place the plate before him, Vincent noticed her hand wasn't just trembling from nerves anymore. It was shaking with purpose. The folded piece of paper appeared beneath his fork, as if by magic. A sleight of hand so smooth that even Vincent, trained to notice everything, almost missed it. Sarah straightened, asked if he needed anything else, and walked away without making eye contact. But Vincent had seen enough in that brief moment. Her pupils were dilated with fear, but her movements were controlled. Whatever was in that note, She'd been planning this moment. Vincent's fingers drummed once against the white tablecloth. In his world, unexpected notes usually meant one of three things: betrayal, opportunity, or death. Sometimes all three at once. He glanced around the restaurant, noting exit routes, counting potential witnesses, assessing threats. Everything appeared normal. Couples sharing intimate dinners, business associates sealing deals over expensive bottles of wine, families celebrating special occasions. Yet the weight of that small piece of paper beneath his silverware felt heavier than the decisions that had shaped his entire criminal empire. He picked up his knife and fork, cutting into the perfectly prepared steak. Blood pooled on the white plate, deep red against pristine porcelain. The meat was exactly as he'd ordered it, but his appetite had vanished. That note demanded attention, but opening it in public would be a mistake. Vincent had learned patience through decades of careful maneuvering through dangerous waters. Whatever Sarah had to say could wait until he could read it safely, but curiosity gnawed at him like a physical ache. In 40 years of criminal enterprise, Vincent had received countless messages, threats from rivals, pleas from desperate associates, intelligence from informants, warnings from allies. Each one had been delivered through established channels by trusted intermediaries. Never had a random waitress at his favorite restaurant risked her job, possibly her life, to slip him a note during dinner service. The wine tasted bitter against his tongue as questions multiplied in his mind. How did Sarah know who he was? What could she possibly know that would be worth the enormous risk she'd just taken? Was this an elaborate setup by law enforcement, using an innocent-looking young woman to gather evidence? Or was something else entirely at play? Vincent forced himself to eat slowly, maintaining the appearance of a man enjoying his evening meal. But beneath the surface, every instinct honed by decades of survival was screaming that this moment would change everything. The note felt like a loaded gun pressed against his temple. He couldn't ignore it, but opening it might pull the trigger on consequences he couldn't control. As he methodically worked through his dinner, Vincent studied Sarah from his peripheral vision. She moved through her section with professional efficiency, but he caught her glancing toward his table every few minutes. Not the casual attention of a waitress checking on her customer, but the focused observation of someone waiting for a reaction. Someone whose entire world might depend on what happened next. The restaurant's comfortable atmosphere now felt oppressive. Every laugh seemed forced, every conversation potentially dangerous. Vincent realized he was no longer just a customer enjoying dinner at his favorite establishment. He had become a player in a game whose rules he didn't yet understand, holding a piece of paper that might contain his salvation or his destruction. The weight of that folded paper seemed to increase with every passing second. Vincent finished his wine, the rich Chianti doing nothing to calm the storm brewing in his chest. He'd built his reputation on reading situations, on knowing when to act and when to wait. But this moment defied all his experience. A young waitress had just handed him what could be either his death warrant or his lifeline, and he was sitting in a crowded restaurant with no way to know which. Sarah appeared at his table again, this time with the dessert menu. Her voice was steady as she asked if he'd like to see their selection. But Vincent caught the barely perceptible tremor in her words. She was terrified, yet she'd still approached him again. Either she was the bravest fool he'd ever encountered, or she knew something that made the risk worthwhile. Just the check, Vincent said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. For a split second, their gazes locked, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just fear in her eyes, it was recognition. She knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, she knew something about his world that she shouldn't. As Sarah walked away, Vincent's mind raced through possibilities. His organization had been careful, methodical. They'd kept their legitimate businesses clean, their illegal operations compartmentalized. But federal pressure had been mounting for months. 3 of his associates had been arrested in the past 6 weeks on seemingly unrelated charges. His lawyer had warned him that someone was building a case, piece by piece, connection by connection. The note felt like it was burning a hole through the tablecloth. Vincent's fingers itched to unfold it, but years of survival instincts held him back. The restaurant suddenly felt like enemy territory. Every face could belong to an undercover agent. Every server could be wired. Every conversation could be monitored. He was trapped in a glass box, visible from every angle, with a secret that demanded immediate attention. Vincent placed his napkin on the table and stood up, his movement fluid and controlled, despite the chaos in his mind. He walked toward the men's room, each step measured and deliberate. The note remained hidden beneath his palm, pressed against his leg as he moved through the dining room. Behind him, he sensed rather than saw Sarah watching his departure. The restroom was empty, a small mercy. Vincent locked himself in the furthest stall and finally allowed himself to examine what Sarah had risked everything to give him. His hands, steady through countless life or death situations, trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. The message was brief, written in careful block letters that suggested education and intelligence. They know about the warehouse. Federal raid planned for tomorrow night. You have less than 18 hours. This is not a trap. Check your phone in exactly 10 minutes. Sarah Martinez, FBI. The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. FBI. The young waitress with the nervous hands and careful movements was a federal agent. But instead of arresting him, instead of gathering evidence for a conviction, she was warning him. The implications crashed over him like a tide of ice water. Either this was the most elaborate sting operation in law enforcement history, or Agent Sarah Martinez had just committed career suicide to save his life. Vincent read the note 3 more times, memorizing every word before tearing it into tiny pieces and flushing them away. His mind shifted into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive through decades of warfare. If Sarah was telling the truth, his entire operation was compromised. The warehouse where they stored everything from stolen goods to financial records would be swarming with federal agents tomorrow night. But why would an FBI agent warn him? He returned to his table, leaving cash for the bill and a generous tip. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding in the kitchen, knowing that her message had been delivered and her fate was now out of her hands. Vincent walked out of Bellanota with the same calm dignity he'd entered with, but internally, he was already 3 moves ahead in a deadly game of chess. Exactly 10 minutes later, as he sat in his car in the restaurant parking lot, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Coffee shop on 5th Street, 20 minutes. Come alone. Your life depends on it. Vincent stared at the message, his mind processing the impossible situation he found himself in. An FBI agent was asking to meet him privately, having already committed what amounted to treason by warning him about a federal raid. This violated every rule of engagement he'd learned in 40 years of criminal enterprise. Law enforcement didn't help criminals escape justice. They didn't risk their careers to save the very people they were supposed to arrest. But Sarah Martinez had done exactly that, and Vincent needed to know why. The coffee shop was a small, dimly lit place that stayed open late for the university crowd. Vincent arrived early, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines to all entrances. His hand rested casually near the concealed weapon beneath his jacket, though he suspected bullets wouldn't solve whatever was about to unfold. This was about information, about secrets that ran deeper than federal investigations and criminal enterprises. Sarah entered exactly on time, having changed from her waitress uniform into jeans and a dark sweater. She looked younger without the professional facade, more vulnerable. But Vincent could see the steel beneath her nervous exterior as she approached his table. This woman had just betrayed her oath, her career, possibly her life, and she was still moving forward with grim determination. She sat down across from him without ordering anything, her hands folded tightly on the small table between them. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute conviction. Mr. Torino, my real name is Sarah Martinez. and I'm a federal agent assigned to investigate your organization. But tonight, I'm not here as an agent. I'm here as someone whose life you saved 15 years ago, and I'm trying to return the favor before it's too late." Vincent's world tilted on its axis as Sarah's words sank in. 15 years ago. His mind raced backward through time, searching for a connection that could explain this impossible moment. A federal agent claiming he'd saved her life. The pieces of the puzzle scattered like leaves in a hurricane, refusing to form a coherent picture. "I don't understand," Vincent said, his voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. The steady hum of conversation and clinking cups provided perfect cover for their dangerous exchange, but he felt exposed nonetheless. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, yet something in Sarah's eyes spoke of truth too raw to fabricate. Sarah leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her purse. She withdrew a small, worn photograph and slid it across the table. Vincent glanced down and felt his breath catch in his throat. The image showed a young girl, maybe 10 years old, with the same auburn hair and intelligent eyes as the woman sitting before him, but it was the setting that made his blood run cold. The photograph had been taken outside a rundown apartment building in the worst part of the city. Vincent remembered that building. He remembered that night. Most of all, he remembered the fire. "You were there," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "December 15th, 15 years ago. The Rodriguez family lived in apartment 3B. My mother was Maria Rodriguez, and I was Sarah Rodriguez then. I didn't become Martinez until I was adopted after the fire." The memories crashed over Vincent like a tidal wave. He'd been conducting business in that neighborhood, meeting with a local dealer who'd been skimming money from their operations. The meeting had gone badly, ending with the dealer's unfortunate demise in the building's basement. Vincent had been leaving through the back exit when he'd smelled smoke. The fire had started on the second floor, an electrical problem that turned deadly in a building with faulty wiring and no working smoke detectors. By the time Vincent reached the street, flames were already licking at the third-floor windows. He could have walked away, should have walked away. His car was parked 2 blocks away, and every second he lingered increased his risk of being connected to the body in the basement. But then he'd heard the screaming. "I remember," Vincent said slowly, his voice rougher than he intended. "Your mother was trapped. The stairs had collapsed, and the fire department hadn't arrived yet." Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "She was trying to get me out through the window. The drop was too far for a 10-year-old, but she was going to lower me down anyway. She was terrified I'd fall and break my neck, but staying meant burning alive." Vincent could see it all again, as clearly as if it were happening in front of him. The desperate woman at the third-floor window, the child crying in her arms, the impossible choice between certain death and probable death. He'd looked around the empty street, knowing that every moment of delay brought him closer to discovery. Then he'd done something that went against every rule of his profession. "I found the construction site next door," Vincent continued the memory. "There was scaffolding equipment, extension ladders. I dragged one over and climbed up to your window. You saved both of us," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "You carried me down first, then went back for my mother. She died 3 days later from smoke inhalation. But she lived long enough to see me safe, long enough to tell me about the man who risked everything to save 2 strangers." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too crowded. Vincent's carefully constructed world was crumbling around a single act of humanity he'd tried to forget for 15 years. He'd told himself it was a moment of weakness, a deviation from the cold logic that kept him alive in a ruthless world. Now that moment had returned to haunt him in the form of an FBI agent with a debt she felt compelled to repay. "She described you perfectly," Sarah continued. "The expensive suit, the gray eyes, the way you moved like you owned the world. But most of all, she remembered your voice when you told her everything would be okay. She made me promise to find you someday, to thank you properly." Vincent's laugh was bitter and hollow. So you became a federal agent to hunt me down? I became a federal agent because of you, Sarah corrected. After my mother died, I was placed in foster care. The Martinez family adopted me, gave me their name, their love, their values. They were good people, law-abiding people. But I never forgot what you did that night. I never forgot that sometimes the line between good and evil isn't as clear as we want it to be. The irony was almost too much to bear. Vincent had spent 15 years trying to forget his moment of weakness, while Sarah had spent those same years building her life around the memory of his unexpected compassion. She'd joined the FBI not despite knowing who he was, but because of it. She understood that morality wasn't black and white, that even monsters could choose humanity in crucial moments. When I was assigned to your case 6 months ago, I thought it was fate, Sarah said. I was finally going to meet the man who saved my life. I was going to understand how someone capable of such kindness could also be capable of, she gestured helplessly, unable to finish the sentence, of murder, Vincent supplied coldly, of extortion, drug trafficking, money laundering. Let's not pretend I'm anything other than what I am, Agent Martinez. But that's just it, Sarah pressed on. You're not just what you are. That night 15 years ago proved it. You had every reason to leave us there, helping us put you at enormous risk, and you gained nothing from it. Nothing except the knowledge that you'd saved 2 innocent lives. Vincent felt the walls closing in around him. This conversation was dangerous on multiple levels. Every word Sarah spoke was a potential weapon that could be used against him in court. Every admission was evidence of criminal activity. Yet he found himself unable to walk away from this reckoning he'd never expected to face. Why? He asked simply. Why throw away your career, your life, everything you've built, to warn me about tomorrow night? Sarah's eyes met his across the small table, and Vincent saw 15 years of internal struggle reflected in their depths. Because I've spent months investigating you, Mr. Torino. I've seen the evidence, read the files, interviewed the witnesses. I know exactly what you are and what you've done. But I also know that without you, I would have died in that fire. My mother would have died believing she'd failed to save me. She paused, struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. I can't reconcile those two realities. The man who saved my life, and the man whose organization has caused so much pain. So I made a choice. I decided that one act of genuine heroism deserved one act of genuine gratitude, even if it destroys everything I've worked for. Vincent stared at her for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what she'd just revealed. An FBI agent had committed career suicide based on a childhood memory and a moral debt she felt compelled to repay. Ish and most noble. It was simultaneously the most fool thing he'd ever witnessed. The raid tomorrow night, he said finally. How much do they know? Sarah's professional training warred with her personal loyalty, but eventually, she spoke in careful, measured tones. Everything, Mr. Torino. They know about the warehouse, the financial records, the connection to your legitimate businesses. They know about your nephew Tony's involvement and the corruption at the docks. Someone inside your organization has been feeding them information for months. The betrayal hit Vincent like a physical blow. Somewhere in his carefully vetted inner circle was a traitor who'd been systematically dismantling his empire from within. The federal investigation wasn't just about building a case anymore. It was about delivering a killing blow that would destroy everything he'd built over 4 decades. Who? The single word carried the weight of Vincent's fury and the promise of terrible retribution. I don't know, Sarah admitted. That information is compartmentalized above my clearance level. I only know what I need to know for my specific assignment, which was documenting the restaurant meetings and your daily routines. Vincent's mind shifted into survival mode, calculating options and contingencies with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive in a world where weakness meant death. The warehouse could be cleaned out, but not without enormous losses. His financial records could be moved, but the process would leave digital footprints that could be followed. Worst of all, If federal agents were planning a raid, they already had enough evidence to secure conviction on multiple charges. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "Something I probably shouldn't tell you, but something you need to know." Vincent waited, knowing that whatever came next would be the final nail in the coffin of his old life. The investigation isn't just federal. There are elements from organized crime task forces in 3 states, international cooperation from agencies tracking your overseas connections, and financial crimes units that have been building cases for years. Tomorrow night isn't just a raid, Mr. Torino. It's the culmination of the largest organized crime investigation in the region's history. The scope of the operation stunned Vincent into silence. This wasn't just about his organization anymore. This was about dismantling an entire network of criminal enterprises, with his arrest serving as the cornerstone that would bring down dozens of associates, partners, and rival families. The federal government had been playing a much longer game than he'd realized, and he'd been the unwitting centerpiece of their strategy. "They want you alive?" Sarah continued. "The pressure from above is enormous to bring you in intact, so you can testify against the larger network. But if you resist, if you try to fight your way out tomorrow night, they have authorization to use lethal force." Vincent understood the implication. Surrender meant life in prison but continued existence. Resistance meant death, probably in a hail of bullets that would be justified as self-defense by federal agents. Neither option appealed to him, but at least now he understood the stakes of the game he was playing. "Why are you telling me this?" Vincent asked. "You could have just warned me about the raid. This level of detail makes you an accessory to whatever I do next." Sarah's smile was sad and resigned. "Because 15 years ago, you didn't just save my life, Mr. Torino. You showed me that people are capable of choosing something better than their worst impulses. You proved that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity can triumph over self-interest." She stood up from the table, her movement fluid despite the tremor in her hands. "I became an FBI agent to serve justice, but I've learned that justice isn't always the same as law. Sometimes the right thing to do is the wrong thing according to the rules. Tonight, I'm choosing to be human instead of being an agent." Vincent watched her prepare to leave, knowing that this would likely be the last time they ever spoke. In a few hours, Sarah Martinez would disappear into witness protection or federal prison, depending on how much her superiors discovered about tonight's meeting. Her career was over, her life forever changed, all because of a debt she felt she owed to a man who'd forgotten his own moment of grace. "Agent Martinez!" Vincent called out as she reached the coffee shop door. She turned back, her eyes reflecting the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you became," Vincent said simply. "She would understand why you made this choice." Sarah nodded once, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, and walked out into the night. Vincent remained at the small table for several more minutes, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities. The warehouse had to be evacuated immediately. His financial records needed to be moved to secure locations. Most importantly, he needed to identify and eliminate the traitor within his organization before they could provide any additional information to federal authorities. But beneath the cold calculations of survival, Vincent felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: the weight of moral complexity. Sarah Martinez had just sacrificed everything she'd worked for because of something he'd done 15 years ago, in a moment of uncharacteristic compassion. Her gesture forced him to confront a truth he'd spent years avoiding. He wasn't just the sum of his crimes. He wasn't just the cold, calculating monster that the federal files described. Somewhere beneath the layers of violence and moral compromise was the man who'd risked everything to save 2 strangers from a burning building. Sarah had seen that man, had been saved by him, and had chosen to honor his memory even when it meant betraying everything she'd sworn to protect. Vincent finished his untouched coffee and walked out into the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring either freedom or destruction. But for the first time in decades, he also knew that his choices mattered beyond their strategic value. Someone had seen him at his best and had chosen to believe that version of himself was worth saving. The question now was whether Vincent Torino could find that man again, or whether 15 years of darkness had buried him too deeply to resurrect. The warehouse could wait another hour. The traitor could wait another day. Tonight, Vincent had a more important decision to make about who he wanted to be in whatever time he had remaining. The city stretched out before him, full of shadows and possibilities, and for the first time in years, Vincent wasn't entirely certain which path he would choose. The weight of Sarah's revelation settled over Vincent like a shroud as he drove through the empty streets. Every shadow seemed to hold federal agents, every passing car a potential surveillance team. But beneath the paranoia that had kept him alive for decades, something else stirred. A memory of the man he'd been before the violence, before the empire, before the careful construction of Vincent Torino, the untouchable crime boss. He pulled into the parking garage beneath his downtown office building, the concrete walls offering temporary sanctuary from the world closing in around him. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual, each floor marking another step toward decisions that would define his final chapter. His legitimate businesses occupied the top 3 floors of the building, a maze of law firms, investment companies, and consulting groups that served as the public face of his private empire. Vincent's personal office sat at the corner of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city he'd ruled from the shadows for so long. Tonight, those lights looked different. Each one represented lives that would be affected by whatever he chose to do in the next 18 hours. Some of those people worked for him, depended on him, trusted him to protect them from the consequences of their shared criminality. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his nephew Tony. The text was brief but urgent. "Uncle, we need to talk. Something's wrong at the warehouse. Can you meet me there in an hour?" Vincent stared at the message, his blood turning to ice. Tony was asking him to come to the exact location where federal agents would be conducting their raid tomorrow night. Either his nephew was completely unaware of the impending danger, or Tony was the traitor Sarah had warned him about. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. The realization hit Vincent like a sledgehammer to the chest. Tony, the boy he'd raised after his brother's death, the young man he'd groomed to eventually take over the family business, the only person in the world Vincent had allowed himself to love without reservation. If Tony was the informant, then everything Vincent had built his life around was a lie. Vincent's story reminds us that even in the darkest corners of human existence, moments of grace can reshape entire lives. That single act of heroism 15 years ago created ripples that eventually returned as Sarah's desperate warning, proving that kindness never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to resurface. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery. Some say Vincent disappeared that night, using Sarah's intelligence to vanish before the federal net closed around him. Others believe he chose to face his reckoning head-on, finally accepting the consequences of decades spent building an empire on other people's pain. The warehouse raid the following night found nothing but empty rooms and shredded documents. Sarah Martinez was quietly transferred to a desk job in a distant field office. Her career effectively over, but her conscience finally clear. She'd repaid a debt that had haunted her since childhood, choosing humanity over duty in a moment that defined her true character. The truth is, we all carry the capacity for both darkness and light. Vincent's story shows us that a single choice to do right, even when it costs us everything, can echo through time in ways we never imagine. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply choose to be better than our worst impulses.